Hello, puppies and kittens. Welcome to another episode of Blasphemers Bible with the usual assemblage. Welcome back, Mark.
Hey, how's it
Morning,
going?
Lawrence.
Morning.
How you do, Isaac? Isaac, Ember, Tomer. Of course, we're going without Lilith
Hello.
today. Yeah. She's in jolly old England, don't you know?
Man, what a bummer.
We hope she's having a good time.
Who goes to England?
So, we're going to jump right into it. Deuteronomy 17. When are we going to get out of this book?
You know, I promise it feels a lot longer than it actually is.
But oh man, the chapters after that, especially like 21 to 23 and 28, are very, 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 very spicy.
Oh, good.
Caliente.
I don't need to know any more of the legal statutes on dietary conditions and all that.
It gets better. I promise you that. It gets better.
Arn, I think you're gonna actually enjoy chapter 28 because you're gonna be like,
he'll
this
read
is-
it.
Yeah, I wanted to read chapter 28, but I guess
Aaron's better than with the curses. I
you
feel.
know, yeah, maybe he should experience.
That
maybe he
shocked
should
look,
experience
though.
But I remember when I first read it on Atheist Sunday School, I was like, my eyes were like wide. I was like, "What the fuck is this?" Because it was nuts.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's see if we can get there this afternoon.
Speed reading.
Yeah.
No shot.
And speaking of which, who is reading today?
I can go. I think I've got my gizmo working today.
Okay.
Sure. You can finish the chapter. It's only 20 verses.
Alrighty.
Do not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep that has any defect or flaw in it, for that would be detestable to him. If a man or woman living among you in one of the towns the Lord gives you is found doing evil in the eyes of the Lord your God, in violation of his covenant, and contrary to my command has worshipped other gods, bowing down to them or to the sun or the moon or the stars in the sky, and this has been brought to your attention, then you must investigate it thoroughly. If it is true, and it has been proved that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, take the man or woman who has done this evil deed to your city gate and stone that person to death. On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a person is to be put to death, but no one is to be put to death on the testimony of only 1 witness. The hands of the witnesses must be the first in putting that person to death, and then the hands of all the people. You must purge the evil from among you. If cases come before your courts that are too difficult for you to judge, whether bloodshed, lawsuits, or assaults, take them to the place the Lord your God will choose. Go to the Levitical priest and to the judge who is in office at the time. Inquire of them, and they will give you the verdict. You must act according to the decisions they give you at the place the Lord will choose. Be careful to do everything they instruct you to do. Act according to whatever they teach you and the decisions they give you. Do not turn aside from what they tell you to the right or to the left. Anyone who shows contempt for the judge or for the priest who stands ministering there to the Lord your God is to be put to death. You must purge the evil from Israel. All the people will hear and be afraid, and will not be contemptuous again. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, "Let us set a king over us like all the nations around us," be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites, Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or Solomon, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over the kingdom of Israel.
So a lot of time, very often, I've heard the faithful tell me or deny that the Bible says that believers are required to murder their own children, their own family members, if they say that they believe in a different religion, or if they don't believe in any God at all anymore. And this is just one of a few places where the Bible's explicit. The Bible does say, and I see also the conversation between the Muslims and the Christians, where Christians criticize the Muslims because the Quran says kill the infidel. The Muslims say no, it doesn't. The Bible says that. And the Christians say no, the Bible doesn't say that. Yeah, it fucking does. Right here, just read it.
And then there's also, the excommunication aspect, like if you're part of like a Jehovah's Witness church, and you become an apostate, your own family has to cut you off. You're no longer in communication with your relatives because you've exited the cult.
Well, that just means that
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
No,
It's a deep voice, but it's not James Earl Jones.
it's true. We do what we can.
I find the fact that in Deuteronomy they make a much bigger deal out of kind of checking these things than we got in Leviticus, and that points towards a much more centralized form. So like even at the beginning of this, right, where they're like, oh, make sure you look into it. What do they say, that there was do an inquiry, or I forget the term that was used. Do a thorough inquiry, right? We had that before with the with the other times they said, if there is someone trying to get you to follow other gods, sort of thing, right? So now in Leviticus, I don't remember them ever saying, oh, well, let's check it before we get into any crazy what's the word I'm looking for, crazy punishment or something, right? Like, let's check. So it is interesting that they are doing an actual inquiry into these things. There's also this link with the Deuteronomistic history, because it's talking about you do not, what is it, you do not say, or you should not say for yourselves, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. So that's so right before Saul is installed as king.
Yes.
In the Deuteronomistic history, the people are like, we want a king too, just like everybody else does. But then God's like, you know what? I mean, I'll give you a king, but you guys aren't gonna like it. So this is kind of indicative of I guess what's the word I'm looking for? It's a pretense for the Paul thing, or sorry, the Saul thing.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how it says to only appoint a king that God has chosen. So you're not really appointing the king then. God already did.
Well, I guess the prophets will get to
And
control
that phrase, like the nations, only appears in 1 Samuel 8, which is what you're referring to, Lawrence. It doesn't show up anywhere else. It's really interesting how that becomes kind of an argument that, like Lawrence says, I think it's not really part of the Levitical story, perhaps, to put it that way. And also, I think the mentioning of the stars as part of like objects of worship here or idolatry, I'm not so sure if that's also part of the list of things to be like, avoiding in the other texts.
Yes. Yeah.
I was
In
gonna
the
say-
prophets, as you saying Jeremiah and Zephaniah, I have a comment on this.
Yeah, I mean the literal reading isn't stars; it's hosts of heaven. So it
The
could-
hosts of the heavens. Yeah, but that
Yeah,
basically
could be
refers to the
planets
celestial
as well.
bodies. Yeah, the celestial
Celestial bodies.
bodies.
Yeah. I mean the
Celestial
planets
bodies are
just,
pretty hot.
the planets were just thought of as wandering stars.
Lost angels drifting around, never knowing their purpose.
I do want to talk about verse 6 before you guys get ahead of it.
Okay.
I don't know if this is a good time or not.
I mean, I have comments,
Yes.
but I'll wait on that.
Yeah.
So this would be particular to the Jehovah's Witness tradition, because they utilize this verse 6 here as part of what they refer to as the two witness rule, which is kind of a policy for the church, where they use, so I'll read it here. It says, Jehovah's Witnesses use these verses to justify the refusal to report or investigate incidents of child molestation unless 2 or 3 Jehovah's Witnesses have witnessed the event. And there's been cases like, for example, in a 2015 report disclosed that the Australia branch of the Jehovah's Witnesses had records of 1,006 alleged perpetrators of child sex abuse related to more than 1,800 victims since 1950, none of which were actually reported to the police, because the church uses this as a way to manipulate and, kind of hush crimes against children.
I mean, what about the idea that a child isn't eligible to be a witness?
Right. I mean, I think it might even start with that. Like the child on its own cannot be his or her own witness. And so all right, so if there's no one else, but then you have people that also, that don't, even if they are witnesses, people are like intimidated not to, because if they were to do so, then they're bringing upon like bad news and bad reputation to the Jehovah's Witnesses church. So it's like sort of like this airtight system where people are hurting and crimes are being committed due to this misapplication perhaps, or this interpretation of scripture.
I've
You know,
heard
I
the
guess
Council of
before-
Elders
before I forget-
recently,
Go ahead,
or
Albert.
governing body. That's what it is. They recently changed the rules so that the local Kingdom Hall leaders can make a decision if the police need to be involved, rather than strictly follow that two witness rule. But that's a very new thing, as I understand it. Sorry, I interrupted you, Lawrence.
Yeah,
No, it's fine. We started at the
that
same time.
doesn't really solve. Yeah.
So I can't believe that I almost just passed over this. Passed over.
Mhm.
So yes, exactly on that verse 6. This is also the same justification that would lead to the Trinity, because in the New Testament, the one place where we actually get an explicit reference to the Trinity, that's 1 John 5:7-8. There's something called the Johannine comma. That's the only explicit reference to the nature of the Trinity. So that is a far later addition, but it speaks to why it was included in the first place, because it talks about there are 3 that bear witness in heaven. So the same idea there that you can't be put to death on the testimony of one witness would come to apply to God later on, because that's why you needed 3 witnesses. You needed the Holy Spirit, the Son, and the Father. You needed those 3 witnesses, because one of them wouldn't work. You couldn't sentence someone to death. You couldn't condemn someone to hell based on one witness. You needed 3. So that was foundational to Trinitarianism.
Because 3 human
um,
witnesses wouldn't account for the same thing, or 2 other human witnesses.
Yeah, what's wrong with 2?
I don't know.
It feels
As long as they're
post-hackish
both-
to me.
As long as it's an adult male.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it does say people, and at the time women didn't count as people, so
Well, I do have a
Yeah,
comment by
women-
Tertullian about this verse. So
Yeah.
lots of
Yeah,
get to that.
women also
Alright,
are
well-
not eligible to be a witness. I would say quickly that before Thomas starts that the 2 witnesses thing is still kept by religious Jews within the religious courts, but they have a very clear distinction between what is tried in Vedin in a Jewish court of law and what is should be done by like secular law. So generally, it's only things to do with money and like marriage, divorce. Really, is pretty much the only things that are done that Jewish people will choose to go to if there's 2 Jewish people who have a monetary dispute, they will go to a Jewish court of law, where there will be like 3 judges and any sort of like document that they sign, they will have 2 witnesses because of this sort of system. But they generally don't, for criminal cases, they won't use Jewish courts of law. Have no jurisdiction, I guess you could say, in a place that already has secular law.
Right, I got a couple comments to read. Ahmad Sanan says, is the book of Deuteronomy for psychopaths to control their family members in their private lives? It certainly has been used for that purpose.
among other things.
Yes, and the Unlucky Legume says, that part about not collecting horses seems random and oddly specific. Is it possibly targeting a particular king that the author had a problem with?
So hold on the horses thing. What verse was that?
16.
16.
I know the answer to that one. Arn.
Okay. Oh no, this one actually has to do with the fact that during the Assyrian invasion, they were getting, or was it during, like right before the exile, during one of these battles, the Israelites were trying to get horses and help from Egypt. So there are many prophetic texts that kind of look down upon this. There are condemnations by Jeremiah, for example, about not going back to Egypt, not getting horses. In fact, I did a video about this. It's called "The Heavenly Horseman." You can go look into that. But yes, this was specifically because Israelites were trying to get help from Egypt at the time of war, and they were also trying to get horses. But God had this weird thing about horses where only he could have horses because he was the powerful one. So yeah, you can go watch that video.
I think you got
Oh,
that
what-
completely
you should've
wrong,
done with horses.
Lawrence. Lawrence,
He's gotten some tapirs.
yeah, I think you got that completely wrong. I know you no longer hate me, you now hate Sumami, but I mean, I have the evidence why God decided it is wrong to collect horses. It's a picture I found on the internet. Have a look.
Oh.
Hmm.
That's what I picture in my head when I think of a Saxon cowboy.
Took quite a
It's
while,
my
Niagara
but,
the
daughter-
North.
but I got to use it.
Yeah, my daughter loves that picture. She says that is so you.
It's a pretty good
Okay,
All
picture.
right, so all right, so
Yeah,
we're ready to jump to the next chapter.
Commentary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, is there commentary?
Did you know? Yeah.
Wouldn't-
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So I haven't even started it. So on verse 1, on verse 1, Nelson comments, the law of 17:1 is not a technical rule defining blemish for priests, but a guideline for laypersons akin to the parallel 15:21, where lameness and blindness are defects obvious to all. The motivation clause uses the category to'eva, repugnant, in its ritual or cultic sense. Compare 7:5 and Leviticus 18:22, end quote. Rashi read davara, literally bad thing, flaw in the NIV, or evil favoredness in the KJV, as dibura, bad speech. Thus, he understood this verse as an admonition to one who would make sacrifices abominable through an evil utterance. And Sadigon renders an ugly thing. On verse 3, Weinfeld notes that Astor worship was widespread in Israel, probably around the days of Manasseh in the 7th century BCE, as seen in 2 Kings 21:3 and 23:5 and 11. Beginning from this period, several prophets went against this type of worship, such as Jeremiah in 7:18, 19:13, 44:17, and Zephaniah 1:5, whose origin was from Assyria. He writes that Deuteronomy, which was probably written during this period, contributed to this struggle. Astor worship is not mentioned in the Torah outside of Deuteronomy. On verse 5, which I'm following the KJV here because it's a bit more clear than the NIV, which have committed that wicked thing unto the gates, even that man or that woman. The Septuagint and the Temple Scroll omit this phrase. McCarthy writes that the volage of the two versions most likely represents an earlier phase of what is now a, quote, rather verbose Hebrew text, end quote. And Targums Jonathan reads, unto the gate of your house of judgment, a rendition which Rashi rejects based on the use of the word sha'arecha, your gate, in verses 2 and 8, which refers to the city gates. On verse 6, 2 or more witnesses. Rashi asks, if a testimony is valid with 2 witnesses, why is 3 specified? Based on Talmud Makot 5b, he answers, quote, to compare 3 to 2, just as 2 comprise a single entity, so 3 comprise a single entity. Hence, none are liable as conspiring witnesses unless all are convicted as conspirators, end quote. Now, Commentators writes that as many witnesses as are available must be heard, so that the truth may be clear. Tigay supports this interpretation and takes 2 or 3 to mean 2 or more. Compare a day or 2, meaning a day or more, in Exodus 21:21. Lundbom notes the opinion of John David Michaelis here. 3 witnesses are required instead of 2 in cases where one witness is at the same time an accuser or an informer. Nelson supports this interpretation. Tertullian, in Against Marcion 4:43-2, wrote that the 2 witnesses, i.e. the angels, at Jesus' resurrection in Luke 24:4, fulfilled this law. On verse 7, the hands of the witnesses must be the first in putting that person to death. Bechol Shor writes that the witnesses throw first to encourage the rest to stone him. Gelsonides writes that the witnesses throw first to affirm the truth of their testimony. And Nelson adds that this is done to emphasize the witness's responsibility for not bearing false witness, as seen in 19:18-19. On verse 8, Lundbom comments, the present law follows that the appointment of judges and officers in 16 verses 18-20. Both passages are to be compared with 2 Chronicles 19:5-11, which reports Jehoshaphat's appointment of judges in the cities of Judah and the establishment of a high court consisting of priests and national leaders in Jerusalem. This high court became the prototype of the Great Sanhedrin in the Second Temple period. It met in Jerusalem and was comprised of 70 or 71 members, depending on whether the presiding high priest was included or omitted from the list, as in Mishnah Sanhedrin 1:5-6 and Shavuot 2:2. The Great Sanhedrin consisted of chief priests, elders, scribes, and other leading citizens. On the same verse about bloodshed, and listen to the NIV, in Hebrew it's ben dam ledam, between blood and blood, literally. Targums Jonathan, Rashi, and Bechol Shor read it as between impure blood and pure blood, i.e. menstruation. Most commentators, however, took it as dealing with homicide cases, whether manslaughter or premeditated murder. The assault, again in the same verse, in Hebrew, ben nega lenega, literally between a nega and a nega. And the word nega can mean disease or plague, as seen in Genesis 12:17 and Exodus 11:1, but also stroke or injury, seen in Deuteronomy 21:5 and 2 Samuel 7:14. The Targums read nega as plague, with Targum Pseudo Jonathan reading between a plague of leprosy or of the scalp. Tigay supports reading injury, and so this refers to physical assault. The Septuagint adds dispute from dispute. McCarthy notes Weber's opinion that this fourth category is a gloss on the part of the translator. On verse 9, the Levitical priests and to the judge. Weinfeld comments, the combination of a priest and a judge was acceptable probably from earlier times. Since the trial was a religious matter that is related to the temple, it is only natural the priests dealt with judgment, as seen in Hosea 5:1, Micah 3:11, and Ezekiel 44:24. The priests are the instructors of the Torah, as seen in Jeremiah 2:8, 18:19, and Ezekiel 7:26, and the protectors of the written Torah, as seen in Deuteronomy 31, 9, and 26. The priests in the central courthouse dealt with religious ritual matters, sanctity and secular matters, purity and impurity, etc. And the judge dealt with civil matters, as seen in 2 Chronicles 19:11, end quote. Tigay notes that since the verse uses judge and not judges, this could mean that the court had only one judge. He notes that others say that the singular refers to all judges collectively or to the head of the judges. Ibn Esa writes that this refers to the king. On verse 11, Nelson writes that verse 11 distinguishes between exactly the law, in Hebrew pi haTorah, and the ruling, hamishpat, referring to different areas of competence. Law would be the priestly answer based on priestly lore or oracle, and ruling would be the decision of a judge based on precedent or accepted legal standards. The Septuagint and Vulgate omit whatever they teach you. McCarthy writes this could be understood in terms of the Septuagint's tendency to remove repetitive phrases, or that these words might be a later addition to the Masoretic text to emphasize the relationship between instruction and Torah. On verse 12, anyone who shows contempt is to be put to death. Nelson writes that the death sentence makes sense, since any decision made based on ritual would originate from Yahweh. Tigay writes that the person, quote unquote, anyone in the NIV, in this verse refers to one of the parties to the case. Lundbom notes the opinions of Dale Patrick and Louis Stuhlman that the persons referred here are members of the lower court, who are obliged to abide by the higher court's ruling. According to Hittite Law 173, a defiance of a high court decision is a capital offense. On verses...
I just want to say for verses 11 and 12 about like the judge's ruling and you should follow them and stuff like this. The rabbis interpreted these verses as meaning like if the rabbis enact new commandments or laws or whatever, and they are accepted by the people, then they are kind of, this is kind of saying you should follow these laws. Like, so some examples of rabbinical commandments are lighting the candles on Hanukkah. Hanukkah didn't happen until after the Old Testament was written. There is a book of but it's not part of the Jewish canon, at least. And only the Talmud kind of talks about, okay, what do you do on Hanukkah? So lighting the candles is a rabbinic mitzvah commandment. And then you also have like reading the Book of Esther on Purim, fasting on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is when a few bad things happen, but specifically the destruction of the temple. And then you have like a few other things, and it's kind of like these verses are kind of the scriptural source of yes, the sages, the judges, whatever, they can enact new laws and they must be followed, even though they're not in the Bible.
Okay. On verses 14 to 15, Lundbom comments, the Deuteronomic preacher anticipates in Israel precisely what occurred later. People will want a king like the other nations. Moses therefore grants permission, just as Samuel finally did, with the proviso that the king be chosen by Yahweh. Von Rad says the monarchy is a concession to later reality. which may also be indicated by many provisos and warnings of what kingship is not to be, and only one positive directive, namely that the king be sure to keep the law and its statutes. Uh, Other scholars see Deuteronomy as a whole, and this law in particular, as shall be delimiting the power of the king, particularly when a comparison is made to kingship elsewhere in the ancient Near East. Weinfeld, however, thinks that Deuteronomy has a positive attitude toward kingship, the whole of the Deuteronomy Code, which in his view is a manual for the king and the people. He points out that the present verses are the only ones in Pentateuchal law to deal with a king.
Okay, so the king's power is limited, but not that of the clergy, because God gets to make all the decisions, and there's only one way to figure out what God said, isn't there?
Well, I
And
mean,
he's sure not going to
kinda.
clarify.
Like he's it's kind of seen as like the law of the land. The difference between secular institution and religious institution was a fine line.
Yeah. It seems to me that this chapter, I mean, obviously written later, seems to be even later. Like maybe there was a period where there was a monarch with absolute authority, and then the Levites, um, enact in these chapters are enacting, come to the place where God chooses, Jerusalem, get judgment from Levites. The king doesn't have absolute power. It seems to be almost like a later, I don't know what the word is, like, after the Magna Carta has been written, the king doesn't have absolute control. Um, you know what I mean?
Like anachronistic.
Yeah, like I'm not saying it's definitely anachronistic. It seems to be evidence to me, at least, that this was written, besides all the other bits in Deuteronomy which hint to a Levitical writing much later on. This seems to be as well. Like, yeah.
The other thing that seems to be doing to me is that if considering First Samuel, I think we get a glimpse that there's a period where the land's being ruled by judges
Yeah.
before there comes King Saul. But this just has this amazing foresight of rules and things concerning a king, where history on these other books seem to kind of display that there's a process. So how could that be the case?
Yeah, it's like God didn't want a king, but now it's like, oh no, kings are fine. They just have to listen to the Levites.
As long as the king does whatever the priest tells him.
Yeah. Have we said anything about verse 17 and the whole
No.
many wives?
No, I have
Okay.
a comment on this, unfortunately. So on but first on verse
He
15.
still has to talk about the horses.
Yeah, I still have that. So on verse 15, he must not. Yeah, first on verse 15, he must not. Sorry, he must be from among your fellow Israelites. So Tigay comments, no reason is given for requiring that the king not be a foreigner. It may have been self-evident that the people would feel more secure with one of their own as king, as seen in Judges 9:2, 2 Samuel 5:1, and compare Maimonides in Guide 350. However, given Deuteronomy's priorities, it is likely that the book objects to a foreigner because he would not be a loyal monotheistic worshipper of the Lord and would probably lead the people into apostasy, as suggested by Rashbam, Bechosho, and Gersonides. The likelihood of a foreigner becoming king was probably greatest in the case of coup d'etat, since usurpers were often military officers, and military officers were sometimes foreign mercenaries.
Coup d'etat.
Yeah. On verses 16 to 17, the prohibitions on multiplying horses, wives, and wealth are exactly what Solomon did, as seen in 1 Kings 5:6, 10:14, 24-28, and 11:1-4. Tigay notes that some scholars assert that these prohibitions are based on Solomon's actions and are intended to prevent them in the future. However, only the multiplicity of women is considered a sin in 1 Kings, whilst the horses and wealth are the result of his wisdom, as seen in 3:3-13 and 10:23-25. Moreover, it is not told that Solomon sent people back to Egypt. Tigay concludes that if there's a reaction here to a specific king's action or to other historical events, it is hard to identify them precisely.
Yeah, I think Russia, he says, like, he shouldn't have more horses than he needs for his chariots. He shouldn't have more money and gold than he needs to pay his soldiers.
Yeah.
And I think the idea is that like if you have too many horses, then you're going to buy them from Egypt because that's where good horses came from.
Yes.
And
Yes. Horses were
yeah.
famous.
And
Egypt's horses were
also
famous.
the emphasis on reliance on God as well versus military equipment.
It doesn't say limit the military. I mean, at least Russia's perspective is like don't limit military. It's like you should have as many horses as you need for your chariots, and you should have as much gold as you need to pay your soldiers. But it doesn't say you can't have more and more soldiers, and then you need more money like that. Then it's okay. It doesn't. It's interesting.
Yeah. On verse 16, make the on verse 16, make the people return to Egypt to get more horses. Nelson comments, it is uncertain whether this intends to disallow simple commercial transactions or is thinking of trading mercenaries to Egypt for horses. If the latter is the case, perhaps some actual event is in view, such as Manasseh's participation in Ashurbanipal's campaign in Egypt, a possible Judite mercenary colony under Psamtik I, according to Herodotus in Histories 2, 152 and 154, and Letter to Aristeas 13, or other alliances or understandings with Egypt. On the other hand, perhaps this is a metaphorical reference to a reversal of the Exodus. It is even unclear whether these words are intended to be a prohibition or a promise. Promise is suggested by the curse in Deuteronomy 28:68. Perhaps one could say that this is a promise that, by its very nature, implies a command. On verse 17, he must not take many wives. The text gives no specific number of women allowed. Chazal in Sifrei Deuteronomy 159 and Targum Pseudo-Jonathan decreed that he could have no more than 18 wives. The Temple Scroll in 57:70-18 limits the number to just one. But Maimonides in Mishneh Torah Kings and Wars 3:6 writes, even if he has only one wife, he should not constantly be with her, as is the practice of fools. As Proverbs 31:3 states, do not give your strength to women. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the idea of the 18 wives comes from David because he had six
Rashi
wives.
says that. Yeah, because he
He
had
has six wives, and then the prophet says you can have double as many.
Yeah.
Wait, no, six. That would make it 12.
If this is insufficient, then I shall add for you as many and again.
Yeah.
And
but I think there's no limit to the amount of concubines you can have.
Yes, as long as they're not wives.
Yeah. And about he must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. The text gives no reason for this prohibition. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan reads, lest his heart be greatly lifted up and he rebel against the God of heaven. Ibn Ezra writes that this prohibition prevents the king to raise unnecessary taxes. Maimonides in Mishneh Torah Kings and Wars 3:4 writes, any gold and silver which he does accumulate should be given to the temple treasury to be kept there, in readiness for the needs of the community and their wars. It is a commandment to accumulate such treasure stores. The prohibition is only against amassing personal wealth in his own treasure houses. And on verse 18, he is to write for himself. Lundbom and Tigay note that according to the Temple Scroll, 56:20-21, another hand is writing up the scroll for the king. This view is found in Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, which reads, and let the elders write for him, and Sa'ad Gaon. Nevertheless, Lundbom, signing Weinfeld, notes that in a letter written to the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, a colophon says on behalf of the king, quote, I wrote it on tablets and put it in my palace to my constant reading, end quote. In a different description, Ashurbanipal boasts that he is able to read and write. And Philo, in Special Laws 4:160-163, writes that the king is required to make his own copy because writing makes a more lasting impression than does merely reading. About a copy of his law, in Hebrew, Mishneh HaTorah. In the Second Temple period, Mishneh meant repetition in the sense of copy or duplicate, as in Targum Onkelos. The Septuagint reads second law, and from which derives the name of this book, Deuteronomion. McCarthy notes that Greek-speaking Christians accepted this reading. She further writes, Origen, for example, in commenting on the second quote-unquote time that the angel of the Lord spoke to Abraham in Genesis 22:15, develops the theme that what comes in second place is more solid than what comes first, and then illustrates this point with some examples. among which he describes Deuteronomy as a second law, quote unquote, which came after Moses had placed the entire law in the first 4 books, according as seen in homilies on Genesis 9:1. On verse 19, it is to be with him. Chazal in Sifrei Deuteronomy 1:6:1 decreed that a copy of the Torah must always be with him. Quote, when the king goes out to war, it is with him. When he presides in judgment, it is by him. When he sits down, it is beside him, end quote. Since this decree seemed physically difficult, other interpretations were given. Talmud Sanhedrin 21b reads, he writes for his sake 2 Torah scrolls, one that goes out and comes in with him at all times, and one that is placed in his treasury. With regard to the one that goes out and comes in with him, he makes it very small, like an amulet, and he hangs it on his arm, end quote. Tigay notes that post-Talmudic commentators suggested that the king carried a full-sized copy that contained only Deuteronomy or the Decalogue, or that an aide carried a complete full-sized Torah scroll. On he is to read it all the days of his life. Maimonides in Mishneh Torah, Kings and Wars 3:5 writes, the king should be involved with Torah study and the need of Israel by day and by night. Lundbom writes that more accurate to read the verb kara here as to recite or read aloud, as seen in 31:11, and so he shall recite it. This commandment is given to Joshua in Joshua 1:8. By reciting the law, the king learns to fear Yahweh, which is expected of every Israelite, as seen in 4:10. And my final comment on this chapter, verse 20, Nelson proposed that verse 20 may have originally followed verse 17 directly, and that verses 18 to 19 are a later supplement. He writes that perhaps the commandment, quote unquote, refers narrowly to verse 19 or to verses 16 to 19, but it is more likely that it designates the whole law. He further writes, the king's dynasty, i.e. his sons, has the potential to be a long-lasting, but not expressly eternal, contingent on obedience. Perhaps this suggests some sort of reflection on the more ephemeral dynasties of the Northern Kingdom. The royal dynasty, the royal dynasty reigns over, quote unquote, the kingdom, but still, quote, literally in the midst of Bekerev, Israel. And that's it for my comment. Terry.
Okay. Do we have anything else to say on this one before moving to the next chapter?
I'm good.
Okay.
Not much.
All right. So, chapter 18, dealing with offerings for priests and Levites. The Levitical priests, indeed the whole tribe of Levi, are to have no allotment or inheritance with Israel. They shall live on the food offerings presented to the Lord, for that is their inheritance. They shall have no inheritance among their fellow Israelites. The Lord is their inheritance, as he promised them. This is the share due the priests from the people who sacrifice a bull or a sheep, the shoulder, the internal organs, and the meat from the head. You are to give them the first fruits of your grain, new wine and olive oil, and the first wool from the shearing of your sheep. For the Lord your God has chosen them and their descendants out of all of your tribes to stand and minister in the Lord's name always. So these people who lie to you should get all your best stuff in first choice. Oh, I'm sorry. Back to the text. If a Levite moves from one of your towns anywhere in Israel where he is living and comes in all earnestness to the place the Lord will choose, he may minister in the name of the Lord his God, like all his fellow Levites who serve there in the presence of the Lord. He is to share equally in their benefits, even though he has received money from the sale of family possessions. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium or a spiritist who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. Because of these same detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. The nations you will dispossess listen to those who practice sorcery or divination, but as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. The Lord your God will raise you up like raise you up a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. For this is what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see his great fire anymore, or we will die. It's your
Oh,
fault you
that's
can't see God.
why.
That's why you can't see God, because you asked not to see God, and God's just respecting your wishes.
That's it.
And if you change your mind, he won't change his.
Mhm.
The Lord said to me, because he only talks to me, so that makes me extra special, that give me all your first fruits of everything, because the Lord said to me, because the Lord talks to me. He doesn't talk to you. I'm more important than you are, and you have to believe whatever I say. What they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, is to be put to death. You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord?
Why, yes. I might.
If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously. So do not be alarmed.
That's helpful. that consulting the dead bit earlier on, isn't that what we're doing right now? And everyone who reads this book ever is consulting the words of the dead?
Peer pressure.
Well, I mean, like, what came to
We're supposed to
mind
be having a
was,
seance. We're supposed to be using a Ouija board, something like that.
well, the one that bothers me the most is the whole mediums. Man, I hate them. I hate the whole medium thing.
I prefer
And like,
larges.
they seem to have a huge evangelical following. Like, that's
Mm-hmm.
how do we support someone like that, and then read Deuteronomy 18? That's just right. It's the hypocrisy.
Yeah, I
I
mean, I'll
just
just
love.
translate it as you can't be a medium using satanic powers, demonic power, but you can use, mystical God's powers and stuff to talk to the dead somehow, and that's allowed.
Yeah, it's all about the flavor of the magic power. Like, is it vanilla from heaven or is it chocolate from hell? Can't have chocolate. That's no good.
Yeah.
So what happens when these dead saints get up and start wandering around? Are we just not allowed to speak to them?
No consulting them.
Okay.
Shoot fast questions later.
I mean, there's a whole lot of praying, that's for sure.
Just like God sorted out.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start my commentary. First on verse 1, the whole tribe of Levi. Nelson notes that verse 1 is the only passage of Deuteronomy that equates the Levitical priests with the tribe of Levi. Usually, the priests are called the Levitical priests or the priests' sons of Levi. Tigay writes that the phrase the whole tribe of Levi is intended to abolish what is said in Leviticus and Numbers, where the priesthood is limited to Aaron's sons, as in Leviticus 7:28-36 and Numbers 18:9. Thus, Deuteronomy agrees with Korach's argument in Numbers that all the Levites have an equal stance. About that is their inheritance, the Hebrew is venachalato. This could be read as that is their inheritance, or that is his, i.e. God's inheritance, as seen in the Vulgate and Saadia Gaon. McCarthy writes that the presence of this word is awkward and may be a secondary insertion or a marginal gloss on either sacrificial offerings or on Yahweh, which was subsequently incorporated into the text, perhaps an attempt by scribes to correct it, since it presents the Levites as devouring the inheritance of Yahweh, i.e. of Israel. On verse 3, the shoulder, internal organs, and the meat from the head. And the NIV butchers it. Yeah, especially
the
on
NIV, the NIV butchers the meat from the head.
Yes. It's specifically the meat from the head. So the Hebrew is hazroa vehalechayim vehakeva. So the first word, swa, shoulder, translated in the NIV, refers to the part of the leg, quote, from the joint of the lower knee until the rounded protrusion surrounding the thigh bone of the foreleg, end quote, according to Mishnah Chulin 10:4. The word lechayim, the second word, means jaw or cheeks and includes the tongue, according to Mishnah Chulin 10:4, Rashi, and Lundbom. The word keva, which is translated here meat from the head, refers to the fourth stomach of ruminants, as seen in the Septuagint. And Lundbom notes that this stomach was a favorite dish in Athens. So I don't understand where they got the meat from the head if it's the stomach. No clue. So Tigay comments, this list differs from Leviticus 7:32-34, which states that the priests receive the breast and the right thigh of the sacrifice of well-being. Critical theory sees the two passages as reflecting the practices of different times and places. Halakhic exegesis resolved the inconsistency by holding that Deuteronomy's list refers to animals slaughtered for food, not for sacrifice, according to Mishnah Chulin 10:1. However, the noun zevach always refers to a sacrifice, and the notion of sending parts of every animal slaughtered for food in every part of the country to the priests at the central sanctuary is unrealistic. On verses 6-7, Lundbom comments, the closing of sanctuaries and restriction of worship to a central sanctuary in chapter 12 left many Levitical priests without a job. But here it states that any Levite wanting to serve as altar clergy when visiting the central sanctuary shall be permitted to do so. During Josiah's reform, some priests from outlying areas did not avail themselves of the opportunity to come to Jerusalem, but stayed home among their brethren, as in 2 Kings 23:9. They did so presumably by choice.
Yeah, there is a Jewish tradition about how the priests and Levites kind of worked, and there was this system of watches. So throughout the year, each week of the year was kind of given to a different family, let's say. So over the year, every priest in the land would have a time when they would be on duty, and so this and the idea was that the system was kind of like paid for, I guess, like you paid money to choose which part of the year or whatever. So apparently that's what it's talking about when it says where is it, verse 8, because sold to their fathers. So the idea was like, oh, their ancestors paid for this time of the year or whatever. So if it wasn't his watch, so he hadn't paid to minister that week or watch, whatever it was, and he went up to Jerusalem, he was still able to go and minister, and was able to eat some of the food, but not all of the food or whatever. That's kind of, at least that's what the rabbinical interpretation of these verses are. I don't know if that was actually what happened, at a later point.
So on verse 8, the second part of the verse, levad mimekarav al ha'avot in Hebrew, literally exclusive mimekarav, on or plus the fathers, is difficult to interpret. As Nelson and Cohen-Zemach note, it seems like the phrase levad mimekarav should be read as levad min mimekarav, with min meaning from. The word mimkar means sale or wear, according to BDB Dictionary, and so could be read as besides his selling, quote unquote, according to the fathers, as McCarthy renders it. The early translations are varied, as McCarthy explains. The Septuagint has made a valiant attempt to render it as the sale of that which concerns the paternal inheritance, while Vulgate paraphrases. The various Targumic expansions reflect Talmudic, Sukkah 56a, and Midrashic, Sefer Deuteronomy 169, discussions on its practical interpretation. What did the ancestors sell to each other? Targum Onkelos, in its rendering, refers to the priestly dues arising out of the rotation system of keeping watch in the temple services. The rendering of Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, besides the surplus of the sacrifices which the priests eat that Eliezer and Ithamar, their ancestors, made them inherit, reflects a Talmudic discussion contained in Ta'anit 27a, while the fragmented Targum is closer to Sifrei's discussion. The Vulgate also attempts to interpret the text with its addition of in his city and is owed him by succession. on verse 10, one who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire. The Hebrew Bible reads, one who passes their son or daughter in the fire. The Septuagint has cleanse instead of passes. Rashi, based on Talmud Sanhedrin 64b, writes that it refers to Moloch worship, as they made two pyres on either side and then passed the child between both. Lundbom notes that some scholars think this verse refers to child sacrifice, which is known to have been carried out to the god Moloch. He notes that in other Old Testament passages referring to child sacrifice, either saraf to burn or avar to make a pass through is used. In this verse, the verb avar is used, and so he concludes that it probably does refer to child sacrifice, particularly when the same is prohibited in 1231.
Hey, what do you guys think about the idea that this god Moloch, to whom was these children being sacrificed to, that originally it was not like there was a god named Moloch who received such sacrifice, but that rather the Moloch was a type of child sacrifice that was part of maybe the ancient Canaanite context, and then it got sort of rebranded as there's a deity that takes that kind of sacrifice rather than, hey, this is a thing we actually used to do.
Yeah, that seems to be likely the case.
I gotta pop out for 2 minutes to hear the
I have a
half
phone
dialogue,
call.
and I'll be back.
Okay.
You gotta pull out for 2 minutes.
Y'all are popular all of a sudden.
Yeah, he's gotta stay focused during those 2 minutes.
Uh-huh.
Feel that. Yeah, I'm of the understanding now. I'm not an expert, but I try to pay attention to what the experts have to say, and it seems as though, from my lay understanding, that there were just a shit ton of gods all around the region, and pretty much everybody was doing child sacrifice and rituals for this and rituals for that. And as some of the gods started to amalgamate into the Yahweh we know and despise today, certain practices were getting pushed off onto the other gods that we don't like. Like, oh, Yahweh doesn't say do this. That's the other guy. That kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
I
really,
agree.
it was really only two gods that kind of got amalgamated. So it was Baal and El. Those were like the two that really we have to blame for Yahweh.
And then I think what happens is there's going to be, I don't know if we already mentioned that already in Deuteronomy, but there's the sacrifice for the firstborn, or tithe for the firstborn, that kind of becomes the replacement of the sacrificing of the actual firstborn male. So it's kind of like, all right, well, you don't have to sacrifice your male child anymore. You can just, pay the fee. Have you guys heard of this?
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit
Okay.
with the earlier set of laws, how it looks a lot like saying you have to sacrifice your child, but you can redeem them with
Redeem.
rams and such.
Yep. With a goat or a sheep or what have you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll continue my commentary on practices divination or sorcery. I'm following the NIV. In Hebrew, it's kosem ksamim. According to Ezekiel 21:26, which is 21 in the Old Testament, some of the practices of the kosem include shaking arrows, consulting teraphim, and inspecting the liver of animals. The Septuagint reads manteomai, I believe I said it correctly, which according to Lundbom is the general classic term for divine. Rashi renders it one who grasps his divining rod and asks, should I go or not?
I mean,
Yeah.
if you feel bladder pressure, go for it.
And what does it mean to check the liver?
So
that
what they
was
would
a
do
common, like,
is they would like kind of look at its like, it's not just the liver, but like the entrails themselves, and like see how they're like laid out, and they use that for divination. It's unclear exactly like what means what, but that was a practice that we have quite a few references to in the Bible.
Prophets, right? Kind of like
Yeah.
reading the tea.
Yeah, something like that.
Ibn Ezra writes that the kosem predicts the future is in no uncertain terms. Balaam is called Kosem in Joshua 13:22. And they were also found among Philistines, seen in 1 Samuel 6:2, Canaanites in 28:7-8, and Babylonians, Ezekiel 21:26-27, which is 21-22 in the Old Testament. Lundbom writes that the point of Deuteronomy is that these practices derived from Canaanite Baalism and are unworthy of Yahweh worship. On the interpret omens and engages in witchcraft, Hebrew me'onen ve'menachesh. These two types of sorcery are discussed in Leviticus 19:26. On verse 11, cast spells. In Hebrew, chover chever, the root chet beit resh can mean joining or weaving, and thus the casting of spells, according to Nelson. He also notes that in Psalms 58:6, which is 5 in the Old Testament, it means to keep a snake at bay with magic words or sounds. Lundbom notes the Akkadian cognate cheber to make an oral sound or be noisy, and thus the present verse would be one who mutters a sound. Rashi reads, one who gathers flocks of snakes and scorpions or other wild animals into one area, and Ibn Ezra, one who calls the demons together.
It's a lot of divergent interpretations.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
Yeah,
the
Divergent
importance of,
muttering demons.
the importance of like having control over demons, that was huge. It not only during like the medieval period, right, but even before that, you have like the writing of the Testament of Solomon. So the like in that work, Solomon has this ring that gives him control over demons, and he like keeps taking control of successively higher and higher demons until I forget if he gets to the devil at the end, but either way, it was a very important.
So just out of curiosity, Tomer, what remind me, what do they call someone that gathers all these snakes into one place?
Chover chaver.
I'm never going to be able to say that.
That's the one.
Correct.
I like how Tomer said it like as Hebrew as possible. So
Because it is. Like,
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But
It's-
you really
sounds a bit like-
exaggerated the Hebrewness of it.
Hover,
Yeah.
hover, yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds
On-
almost
Bless
like
you.
it should be like friend maker, but I guess
yeah,
like,
because chaver it can also mean friend, but no, it here it means
Yeah.
like to attach, because the lechaber as well means to connect. That I think that's where friend
Right,
comes
right.
from. You connect with him. You know.
So gathering a bunch of snakes together means connect friends?
According to Rashi.
it's how they used to connect. to the
Aaron,
internet back
you're
in the day.
living a biblical life and you didn't even know it.
Wow, everyone pray to Aaron.
On
Okay.
verse 13, blameless, the Hebrew it's tamim. The word also denotes perfect or complete, as seen in 32:4, Genesis 6:9, and Exodus 12:5. Rashi comments, walk with him in utter trust, in anticipation of him. Do not explore the future. Rather, whatever befalls you, accept with perfect trust. Then you will be with him. He will take you as his portion.
It's disturbing.
Yes.
So it's a call against like trying to use sorcery, divining, and stuff to make your heart easy. Just trust in God. Everything will be
Yeah.
fine.
On verse 14, Tigay comments, in the pagan societies of the ancient Near East, the functionaries in question were exceedingly influential. They were regularly consulted by commoners and kings, who would often not make an important move without them. In Israel, too, in periods when such functionaries were tolerated, they were accorded similar statutes. Their standing is reflected in Isaiah 3:2-4, where, in one and the same context, Isaiah foretells the downfall of prophets, augurs, and enchanters, as well as magistrates, elders, and military leaders. On verse 15, will raise up for you a prophet like me. According to 34:10, there never arose a prophet that was like, quote-unquote, Moses. Chizkuni writes that this refers to Joshua. Abravanel writes that like me means that he will be raised as Moses was. Nelson writes that like Moses does not mean equal to Moses, but indicates that this prophet will have the same relationship to the people and to Yahweh's word as Moses did. Tigay notes that since the word prophet is in the singular, some Christians, like in Acts 3:22, Origen and Augustine, and Muslims like Samael al-Maghribi thought that this verse refers to a specific individual, namely Jesus or Muhammad. He writes, however, that the singular is clearly meant collectively, referring to a succession of prophets. And Bechor Shor gives a very anti-Christian interpretation. He writes, from among your people, like myself, i.e., someone of good lineage, in Hebrew miyuchas, from father and mother, and not that his mother keeps him quiet since he was born by way of fornication.
Yeah, I was gonna say the Sermon on the Mount, like that's what Christians are looking at this very text and saying, hey, this is the same thing happening again. And then you've got the Mount of Transfiguration, where something weird kind of like that happens too, with Moses going up the mountain, meeting God. And, that's what they're looking at in support of their Jesus fulfillment.
Yeah, they love
Yeah,
that.
Yeah.
Although
just
the
want to add
whole
to
prophet like me thing might refer to the fact, so like prophecy was like a job, like you were hired by a king to be a prophet, but in this case you were called upon by God to be a prophet. So maybe prophet like me, so of course it would be a fellow Israelite, right? But it would, because that's how it's used before. But the idea of prophecy as this thing that shouldn't any longer be called upon by kings or you should have a job for. No, instead you got to give that role to someone who God himself calls.
And there's a lot of misconception exactly as to what prophecy is. Because, some people think, oh, is that just like predicting the future? This thing, whatever will happen. But I've also heard that no, prophecy is more like retelling of, the good deeds of Yahweh and sort of like recontextualizing what God has already done by way of reminding people and admonishing. And it's more like, it's a sermon in a sense, like, hey, let's be right, but not this prophecy like predicting future events and whatnot.
It's an interesting possibility because I've heard
Yeah.
a number of
interpret
people say that a lot of history, when it comes to divine stuff, God stuff, holy stuff, it's just the same stories recapitulated and repackaged over and over and over. So if you're telling the past, you're also telling the future, and in a certain fashion.
And then in another way too, I think there's a warning here about what a false prophet would constitute that is often overlooked by Christian interpreters. Because if what's determinative here, like what, that they say something and it doesn't come to pass. So we could look at Jesus and let's hold him to his worth, like the things that he said that would occur within his generation, did those things happen? And certainly not. So does that make him a false prophet? And therefore,
That was what I thought. I mean, I just always
Jewish
thought that
perspective, yes.
when Jesus says very explicitly that there are some of you standing here right now who will not even taste of death until you see the Son of Man return at the right hand, coming in the clouds at the right hand of power. Because he talks to a couple of different people and gives slightly different versions of what was supposed to happen. I forget who the other person he was talking to when he gets more explicit about you'll see me in the clouds at the right hand of power and all of that shit. But none of that happened. So he failed his own prophecy. And the reason that people will say, well, how could we go 2,000 years and still believe in this if he failed his own prophecy 1,900 years ago? Well, why is it that we still that so many people today still refer to Native Americans as Indians when we've known literally for centuries that this isn't India?
Well, what's interesting about that, at least, is they're kind of like taking it back, I guess, because like all the all the legal documents call them Indians. So like this is, I've noticed this a lot. In fact, this was in one of my American Indian courses. It's literally called American Indian Studies because like they are trying to like kind of take it of the legal route. So
if you've been to India, it's really hard to get back into that.
I
you
get
know,
it. I
just-
get it. Like I still say Native American, right? But yeah, there is like a movement to kind of take back American Indian as a term because of the fact that it is in all the like the treaties and stuff.
Yeah, I've noticed in my travels, both near to me, the Seneca reservations up the road, they have, giant statues that say Indian on them. Out to the Ute reservation on the border of Colorado and Utah, where their newspapers say the Indian Times. Like, there's just a huge movement to make that word, to own that word.
I feel like we're diverging.
We are,
Oh,
yes.
very.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was trying to get in a little thing about Tom just said something about I think was it Chizkuni who had this thing about what does it mean to be a prophet from a mo like me, and it's to do with lineage and like the reason why that is considered a anti-Christian or anti-Jesus polemic is because there is in the Talmud a story about somebody called Jesus who might be the Jesus of Christianity. Might not be, but in this story, he is a his father is a Roman soldier called Pantera or something like that, and if it's an allusion to Jesus, then it's like it's trying to say, oh, Jesus, like his mother, committed adultery with or fornication or whatever you want to call it with this Roman soldier, and that's where he comes from. So Jesus can't be a prophet because he doesn't have good lineage.
And this guy with the
it's-
Roman soldier as his father, and he was assumed to be the Messiah. Was his name Brian?
No.
Sorry.
Yeah, it was-
Why
okay,
would you
yeah,
ask such a strange?
I think that's where they got the idea from. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I did this section in the Talmud that talks about this specific Jesus. I think this specific Jesus is the most likely one to be based on a historical Jesus or a Christian Jesus, because it also mentions him being killed on Passover or something like that. Although it says hung on a tree, which could mean
Yeah, but
two
that's
different
kind of
things.
the but
It could just be an
would
idiom,
align
yeah.
with like I forget which passage in Deuteronomy, but like it was this
Mm.
whole thing about like, oh, it's a shame to be hung on a tree or something.
Yeah.
And that was
And also, hung on a tree could also mean like they could be how they would have referred to being crucified as well.
Yeah.
And the other thing it says about him is, but then it also said there's also like stories about him going to Egypt and getting like holy words and like writing it in on his arm so that he could take it into the going into the temple, getting the holy word, the name of God, and then being able to like use it to fly and stuff. Or maybe that wasn't him. Whatever. So the Christians in the Middle Ages or whatever, they censored the Talmud, and this story and a couple of others, which might not have anything to do with Jesus. There's like story about like blah blah blah. Jesus is in hell, boiling in excrement or something like that. And but it could
Rude.
be referring to a different Jesus because I think that one is a disciple of who is it? Is it Hillel maybe? And it's like hundreds of years before Jesus. So
I
And
think it's
besides,
really
you can't
interesting.
have Jesus. You can't have Jesus roasting in hell because he runs the place.
True, he does run
a
the place.
name like this have
Yeah.
bad guys in the Talmud with the same name. So yeah, but the Christians saw
there were a
all
lot
of
of
these different
Jesuses.
stories with the same of a guy with that name as bad, and so they censored it out, and they were only kind of put back in like much later. So Christians Christians have a lot of Christians have a thing like, oh, the Talmud says that Jesus is boiling in excrement. So like maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, and if it does, who
Well,
cares?
I just
go
I
ahead.
just want to interject. Do you think we
Mm.
have time for another chapter?
Sure, why not?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
have some commentary left. So,
Okay.
if you want me to
Oh
read
yeah,
it.
finish it.
So
Sure.
on verse 16, according Tigay comments, according to verse 18, the role established for Moses as a result of the people's request is the precedent for making prophecy the permanent channel of God's communication with Israel. Since they requested it, obeying prophets is a commitment they cannot disregard. This precedent requires explanation. Since the law focuses on the mantic role of prophets, the reference to Moses' role at Horeb seems like a non sequitur, since he did not play a mantic role there. Apparently, the precedent is cited to show that the prophets are not merely the counterpart of diviners and magicians. Their mantic and quasi-magical powers are an aspect of their broader role, established at Horeb to serve as God's messengers, communicating his will in all areas of national life. On verse 19, I myself will call to account, that is, God will punish him, according to Ibn Ezra. According to Sifrei Deuteronomy 177, a person who dismisses the words of a prophet is to be put to death. It gives 1 Kings 20 verses 35 to 36 as an example, where a colleague of a prophet ignores his words and then a lion kills him. Saul's death is attributed to a heavenly punishment since he ignored the words of Samuel, according to 1 Samuel 28, 17 to 18. On verse 20, Tigay comments, the Bible records 2 cases in which proceedings were initiated, possibly on the basis of this law, against prophets accused of falsely attributing their prophecies to God. In both cases, they were exonerated. When Micaiah, son of Imlah, prophesied again that Ahab would fall in battle, Ahab had him taken into custody, assuming, wrongly, that he would return from battle safely, and Micaiah's claim to divine authority would be proven false, according to 1 Kings 22, 17 to 28. Jeremiah was tried for false prophecy when he foretold the destruction of Jerusalem. His accusers called for the death penalty, but he was exonerated on the grounds that he truly spoke in the name of the Lord in Jeremiah 26. The prophet mentioned in Deuteronomy 13, 2 to 6 would be covered by this clause. And finally, on 22 to 21, Cohen-Zemach comments, these verses deal with a prophet who claims that the Lord had sent him. There is an affinity between them and Jeremiah 28. In that chapter, Jeremiah pondered, like the people themselves, about the problem presented in verse 21, and he determined the following caveat. The fulfillment of or non-fulfillment of a prophecy is a criterion for identifying a true prophet, but only for prophets of good fortune in Jeremiah 28:9. But for a prophecy of disaster, this rule doesn't always apply. In any case, the rule that Deuteronomy decreed is only valid for the near future, but for the far future, it has no real meaning. That's it from my commentary.
Okay. Let me see if there are any other comments to read. We got Trevor Wright says, aren't there certain pagan deities that parallel the biblical God Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible that suggests the suppression of other deities in Canaan's history to promote Yahwehism?
Yes, but that only did come later on. So it wasn't like this, like it wouldn't, but by the time that we have like that kind of complete suppression, like we would have already had what could, it would have been like the Second Temple period by that point. So
Got
the, so the suppression wouldn't have taken place like during Canaan's history, you know, proper, if there was ever a Canaan proper, which there probably wasn't. But yeah, essentially this stuff would have happened far later. This kind of accumulation of traits would have happened over the course of several hundred years, but then only during the Second Temple period do we start seeing that kind of that kind of suppression of those other gods, or at least during
Okay.
the return from exile.
Okay. All right, I'm going to jump into
Mark has
19
a thing. You're muted.
Wait,
Mark.
yeah.
Yeah, so there is some Egyptian context that's related here, where I think, depending on the point of history, sometimes civilization will have a shift of capital or more centralized type of empire. And so when that happens, oftentimes the deity associated with the capital city becomes the predominant deity. And so that's also evident in the Babylonian histories as well, with god Marduk, when Babylonia became the center of the great Babylonian Empire, which at some point might have encompassed areas of Assyria and areas where other deities were also worshipped as well. But Marduk then became emphasized, and it predominated throughout the land. So I have seen that. It seems like to me.
Okay.
All right, so moving on to 19. Cities of excuse me, just a sec. Will you stop?
Yeah.
Maybe Lawrence should volunteer.
I Man, I'm definitely feeling kind of stuffy, so I
Oh,
don't
okay.
know if.
So never mind.
Okay, I will
Here we
read.
go.
I will, if you will let me. Okay. When the Lord your God has destroyed the nations whose land he is giving you, why would you give somebody something you've destroyed? And when you have driven them out and settled in their towns and houses, because that's what it means by the Lord giving it, you went in and took it. Okay. Then set aside for yourselves 3 cities in the land your God is giving you to possess. Determine the distances involved and divide into 3 parts the land your God is giving you as an inheritance, so that a person who kills someone may flee for refuge to one of these cities. Have you all noticed that when we read Deuteronomy, it all sounds like we've heard this before?
Yeah, I wonder why.
Yeah. Funny
An
thing.
echo. Very
The
strange.
it's like it's the duet in Deuteronomy.
Yes. And I'm still a little mystified as to why we have to have sanctuary cities for murderers.
For
It's
accidental
mostly to await
murder.
trial. That's the thing. Like, so if someone
Yeah.
chases them down, like, no, you got to wait for the trial. You can't just go off and kill them.
Yes.
Okay. This is the rule concerning anyone who kills a person and flees there for safety. Anyone who kills a neighbor unintentionally without malice aforethought. For instance, a man may go into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and as he swings his axe to fell a tree, the head may fly off, hit his neighbor, and kill him. That man may flee to one of these cities and save his life. Otherwise, the avenger of blood might pursue him in a rage, overtake him if the distance is too great, and kill him, even though he is not deserving of death, since he did it to his neighbor without malice aforethought. This is why I command you to set aside for yourselves 3 cities. If the Lord your God enlarges your territory, as he promised on oath to your ancestors, and gives you the whole land he promised them, because you carefully follow all these laws I command you today, to love your God and walk in ways of obedience to him, then you are to set aside 3 more cities. Do this so that innocent blood will not be shed in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, so that you will not be guilty of bloodshed. But if out of hate someone lies in wait, assaults and kills a neighbor, and then flees to one of these cities, the killer shall be sent for by the town elders, be brought back to the city, and be handed over to the avenger of blood to die. Show no pity. You must purge from Israel the guilt of shedding innocent blood, so that it may go well with you. Do not move your neighbor's boundary stone set up by your predecessors in the inheritance you receive in the land the Lord your God is giving to you to possess. One witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of any crime or offense they have committed. Apparently, you don't just need 2 witnesses, you need to say it twice. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. What if you have 4? I'm sorry. If a malicious witness takes the stand to accuse someone of a crime, the 2 people involved in the dispute must stand in the presence of the Lord before the priests and the judges who are in office at the time. The judge must make a thorough investigation, and if the witness proves to be a liar, giving false testimony against a fellow Israelite, then do to the false witness as that witness intended to do to the other party. You must purge the evil from among you. The rest of the people will hear of this and be afraid, and never again will such an evil thing be done to you. Show no pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, because we are copying Hammurabi.
I was just going to say plagiarism for plagiarism.
All right, and that's it for 19.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So I'll start my commentary, or somebody have to say something first.
I'll just say
The
like
idea of
the last
sanctuary-
bit.
The idea of sanctuary cities This this would play a role in some parts of the Deuteronomistic history. It's even kind of alluded to in some of the prophets. In later years, like far later, this would also, and just because I just finished like reading a good amount of stuff on early Christian Ireland, they also kind of had that idea in their territories as well. It was called the Tuath system, and the Tuath system was kind of re, re reformed into this monastery system. But there were certain places you could go within the land to kind of await trial, because there would usually be, if you killed someone, whether it be on purpose or on accident, there's probably someone looking for you trying to kill you. So the idea of these sanctuary cities was kind of permeated through, and that's also why they had to kind of talk about the importance of those boundary markers, which in the ancient world were generally just stones. I mean, you see them in Europe, you see them in Mesopotamia, you see them in Egypt. You see these boundary markers. Many of them are still up today.
Yeah, so is that where the idea of like churches or monasteries being refuge comes from?
I don't know if that specifically is the idea, if that's how that stemmed, but that is how it definitely ended up working.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess it kind of makes sense because it's like where the priests, the cities of refuge were also where Levites lived, as far as I understand. So maybe it's like, oh, the priests live here, be a place of refuge.
Okay, I'll start my commentary on verse 1. This verse is similar to 12:29, where it states that the Israelites will settle in the Canaanites' land. Here it refers to settlement in their towns and homes. Tigay proposed that the text may mean that the law must be implemented immediately, using existing cities and not waiting until new ones are built. On verse 2, Weinfeld proposed that the original law began at verse 2, which stands on its own as an introduction and is parallel to other laws that mention the inheritance of the law after presenting the basic order, as in 1518 and 1914. The three cities, quote unquote, are called cities of refuge in Numbers 35:11. In Deuteronomy 4:41-43, we find three cities of refuge located in Transjordan, which is not part of the promised land. According to Joshua 27, these three cities are Kadesh, Shechem, and Hebron. On verse 3, determine the distances involved. More accurate is prepare for yourself the road. The Septuagint reads calculate or estimate for yourself the way, which according to Lundbom views the preparation as an estimate of distances in each territory to the refuge cities. Weinfeld notes that preparing, in Hebrew tachin, in the sense of measuring, is found in Exodus 16:5, Isaiah 40:12, and Job 28:25.
And there was also idea of having like direction markers as well. And like you went to a crossroad, you'd have a big sign saying this way, refuge or whatever. That sounds anachronistic to me, but I think the Talmud talks about them.
So on verse 5, the head may fly off. The Hebrew Bible reads, and the iron fell, nashal, from the tree. Yigal Yadin, cited by Tigay, writes, a problem facing the axe's manufacture was fitting the blade to the handle in such a manner that it would not fly off in action, end quote. The connection between the blade and the handle is the weak point of the axe. We see this in 2 Kings 6, verses 45. Some, like Rashi and Rashbam, read the verb nashal as remove, as seen in 7:1 and Joshua 5:15. According to this reading, the blade hit the tree and sent a piece of wood that hit the fellow. Tigay rejects this interpretation, since the grammatical antecedent of and he found his fellow dead is the blade and not the piece of wood. And the verse doesn't state that the blade hit the wood, just that it fell whilst wielding the axe.
Yeah, and also the word etz can mean tree. It can also mean wood. So yeah, the metal fell off the wood could also be understood as the head from the handle.
Yeah. On verse 6, the Avenger of Blood, in Hebrew Goel Hadam, this term is found in several places in the Bible and has been discussed in Numbers 35:33. So I don't have to discuss it here. On verses 8 through 9, Lundbom comments, Yahweh's promise to the fathers was a land that included Philistia, Lebanon, and Aram, i.e. Syria, extending as far east as the Euphrates River, as in 1:7-8, 11:22-24. But as verse 9 makes clear, enlargement hinges on Israel keeping the commandments. This expansion never occurred, so additional cities were never designated. A revised assessment of Yahweh's land grant to the fathers is contained in Judges 2:20-3-4, where it says that Yahweh became angry with Israel for covenant disobedience and therefore left inhabitants of these lands where they were in order to test Israel, to see whether Israel would obey the commandments. As a result, Numbers 35:6, Joshua 20 verses 7-8 mention only 6 cities. There in Transjordan and 3 in Transjordan and 3 in Canaan. Had enlargement taken place, there would have been 9 refuge cities. On verse 10, Tigay comments, this verse continues the explanation of the law, stating that where verse 7 fell off. Here, blood of the innocent, Hebrew dam naki, refers to the blood of the accidental killer, since he does not deserve to die. If the community does not prevent his blood from being shed, it will bear the blood guilt created by his death. The shedding of innocent blood brings guilt upon the entire community. Compare verse 13 and 21, 8-9. This guilt is regarded as a palpable, I believe, virtually physical stain, in Greek miasma, comparable to the blood that Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth imagined to be staining her hands. I like how he has Shakespeare here. If it is not eradicated, the welfare of the community is threatened, as when a famine befell Israel because Saul had killed the Gibeonites in 2 Samuel 21:1. On verse 11-13, Nelson comments, the period of refuge for an innocent quote-unquote killer is left open in Deuteronomy, contrast to Numbers 35, 25, and 28, and Joshua 26. But a procedure is provided for the killer guilty of murder. Hometown elders take this responsibility, perhaps because of their role in family law, as in 21, 19-20, 22, 15-18, and 25, 8-9. And the responsibility for localized blood guilt, 21, 3-4. The murderer's fate corresponds literally to the crime itself, in Hebrew vamet, so he dies, at the end of verses 11a and 12. The formulaic motivation in verse 13 is that of 13, 6, and 9, which in the Old Testament are 5 and 8. Perhaps this implies that one may not substitute the payment of blood money for execution. Compare Numbers 35, 31. On verse 14, Weinfeld comments, Scripture prohibits a person from passing the border marks between fields into his fellow's field to enlarge his property. Border stones were used in the ancient Near East to mark territories. In Mesopotamia, these were pillars, known as kuduru stones, on which the field's owner carved his name. Curses to those who damage them or move them from their place, and the symbols of the gods who protect them. Chazalic literature, Talmud Bava Batra 56a, tells of planting squills to make borders. The roots of the squill go deep up to 3 to 4 meters, and even after its uprooting, it is difficult to blur its location. By your predecessors in the same verse, in Hebrew, Rishonim, literally the first ones, Ibn Ezra, Chizkuni, and Lundbom write that this refers to the ancestors, in Proverbs 22:28, Avotecha, who mapped out family allotments at the time of the conquest, as in Joshua 18, 1-10. On verse 15, this law is found in earlier passages, such as 17:6 and Numbers 35:30, regarding capital offenses. Here, the law is generalized to any offense. Nelson suggested that the apodictic style of verse 15, as well as the impersonal casuistic style of verses 16-18, suggests that an older law has been modeled in a Deuteronomic direction, in accordance with 17:6 and 8-9. On verse 17, in the presence of the Lord, Hebrew lifnei Yehovah, before the Lord. Rashi comments that it should seem to them as if they were standing before God. Tigay notes that the phrase often implies a sanctuary, which cannot mean that here. It would be possible for trials to be held at sanctuaries once the local sanctuaries are destroyed, as they were when sacrifice was abolished in the provinces, 2 Kings 23. He writes that either the text intends trials to be held at local places of non-sacrificial worship, or that before the Lord does not refer to the local location of the trial, but to the fact that judges are God's representatives. And he, i.e. God, is with them when they adjudicate, since judgment is God's, according to 117 and 2 Chronicles 19:6. Lundbom proposed that standing before Yahweh means standing before priests and judges who will decide the case at a central sanctuary, as in 17:9 and 25:1. And finally, on verse 19, this is a lex talionis law. Tigay notes that during the Second Temple period, the Sadducees and the Pharisees were divided on the interpretation of this law. He writes, the Sadducees held that talion was to be imposed only if the falsely accused defendant had actually been punished. But the Pharisees noted that the text prescribes talion in return for the witness's scheming, quote unquote, and ruled that once a verdict had been reached, he was subject to punishment if his testimony was found to be false, as in Mishnah Makot 1:6 and Josephus Antiquities 4:219. The plain sense of the reading of the text is that even if the false testimony never leads to a conviction, once it has been given, the witness is subject to punishment, as in Mesopotamian law. The earliest Mesopotamian laws generally punished false witnesses with standard monetary fines. The later laws imposed talion, which made the punishment match the severity of the crime more exactly and rendered false testimony far less palatable to those wealthy enough to afford a mere fine. And that's it for my commentary.
Yeah. So if you testified against someone, and if they were to be found guilty, they would be beheaded, let's say. Then if the witnesses are found guilty, even before a verdict is reached, they would be then beheaded. So life for a life, but then like the other stuff, I think eye for an eye is normally like the monetary compensation.
All right. Surprisingly, we didn't get a lot of comments in chat on this one. I guess it's because Deuteronomy is strangely redundant.
I also think it's because Peter's slacking.
What? I silenced
would
the
say,
troll, Lawrence. I did my job.
I would say, however, that the next chapters, especially 21 to 23, are extremely, extremely interesting because they are very like they're going to make you wonder. I would say that.
By the way,
make me wonder.
Yes.
By the way, as a mod, now you have God powers. You can time people out for 24 hours. So
let's just say that for the commentaries for 21 to 23, each one of them I have like 8 pages.
Wow.
Yeah. There's
Well,
a
get
lot.
ready then.
There's a lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
How much do you have for 20?
I think 4. That's the
Is it
same
worth
number as
doing?
20 as 19.
Okay.
Got
All
20
right. Is
minutes.
it worth
Yeah,
trying
maybe
to
not.
hit 20 today?
If you want.
Everybody else?
We might. We could definitely do the chapter part, but I don't know if we could finish the commentary.
Yeah, probably won't be able to finish the commentary.
We can extend it a bit if you want.
Nah, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I got too much stuff to do, like all the time anymore, and it's strange that I'm just somehow falling further and further behind.
Weirdo.
You ever
that
try to do
works.
so much that you don't get anything done?
Yeah,
That's called procrastinating.
it's just always like bouncing from one thing to another, but then never actually completing any of them. Like I'm in that boat a lot.
It's like when we had that old our old internet system, the slow internet system, when you start like 6 downloads and now you have to wait. Yep. Yeah, Mark, I like your sweater.
Hey.
All right, so are we good for Tuesday?
Yes, Tuesday should be
Yes,
good.
I believe so too.
But-
Let me check in my calendar. Yes.
Also, so on Monday, I believe it's on Monday. Yeah, definitely on Monday. I will be releasing a video on St. Patrick. So the video is already done. Right now, it's if you want to get early access, it's for patrons. But I will be releasing it publicly on Monday, and it was on St. Patrick, and kind of the myth around St. Patrick, because
I
there's
thought you were supposed to do that on like March 17th.
my project was due on Thursday, so I couldn't really hold out that long.
Okay.
But it was a project for class, but the professors seemed to really enjoy it, so hopefully you guys do too.
We're also working on an episode about Krampus, and we were inspired by Krampus not seeing your video, Aaron. That was really cool.
Well, thank you.
We definitely want to be a part of it next year. And
I'm gonna have much cooler outfit. We were looking for somebody that does the forelock thing with the hooves, so that I can have the goat pants that are up on forelock, so I'll be like 6 inches taller.
Wow.
Yeah.
You don't need to be taller. You're tall as fuck.
All right. So thank you very much. I don't know how we're going to plow through if we don't do 20 today, because you're talking about 21, 22, and 23 are all going to be intensive.
Yes.
And it was tough to do. Let's just do 20 today, right? Should we
Really?
slam through it? Yeah, let's just do it.
Sure,
I want to get it
let's
out of
do
here
it.
because the other 3, let's try to get them done together.
Sure.
When you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid of them, because the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt will be with you, unless the chariots are made of iron, because I'm kind of scared of those. When you are about to go into battle, the priest shall come forward and address the army. He shall say, "Hear, Israel, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not panic or be terrified by them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight against your enemies and give you victory." The officers shall say to the army, "Has anyone built a new house and not yet begun to live in it? Let him go home, or he may die in battle and someone else may begin to live in it. Has anyone planted a vineyard and not begun to enjoy it? Let him go home, or he may die in battle and someone else enjoy it. Has anyone become pledged to a woman and not married her? Let him go home, or he may die in battle and someone else marry her." Then the officers shall add, "Is anyone afraid or faint-hearted? Let him go home, so that his fellow soldiers will not become disheartened too." And I think Henry V said, no, this sounds awfully familiar. Anyway, when the officers have finished speaking to the army, they shall appoint commanders over it. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open the gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to the city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women and children, and the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves. And you may use the plunder the Lord your God has given you from your enemies. This is how you are to treat the cities that are at a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they may teach you to follow the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. When you lay siege to a city for a long time, fighting against it to capture it, do not destroy its trees by putting an axe to them, because you can eat their fruit. Do not cut them down. Are the trees people that you should besiege them? However, you may cut down trees that you know are not fruit trees and use them to build siege works until the city at war with you falls. Now, before we get into anybody else's commentary, I got to mention this. Don't cut down the trees, because the trees are not people that you should besiege them. but
Just-
kill everything that breathes, including the women and the children and the animals.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily
No.
explicitly here, but it is
Well,
necessarily
in other
explicit
passages,
Mm.
in other
elsewhere.
passages, it doesn't refer to like everything. It's just about human population.
I mean, it is interesting that it
And-
says a
but
tree
in
is
other
not
at least
passages-
at least the Deuteronomic historian understood it as such.
Well, they
Am
should
I,
be
am I
more
reading
specific.
this wrong? Did it not say elsewhere to kill everything, even the donkeys and the horses and everything?
Well, there was the part where it said, make sure. Well, I don't remember if it was
I
in,
think it was only a specific city, no?
but there was the one thing that once you killed a whole bunch of people, you take the women and you take the women and children for yourselves, right? But that was in Numbers, right?
Mhm.
So in
And you weren't allowed to take the women. You're just allowed to take the children.
oh, that's right,
Well,
right. Just
the
chil-
women, children.
I think much of that, the battles against the Philistines involve that, right? Like it's explicitly saying, the women and the children, don't leave anyone alive because, God forbid,
but-
they'll teach you idolatry, right?
I don't think
Yeah,
the
essentially.
Philistines are. I don't think the Philistines though are counted as the ones. It's the first bit of the chapter, right, where it says you can take the children, livestock, the women, the children, livestock, and everything. You can take the spoils. The Philistine cities would have been, even though they weren't that far away, they weren't technically within the land. So, they would have been.
So
the
anything
those fools.
anything that doesn't produce something useful for you. So for the people that already lived in the land, yes, they could they could tempt you to idolatry. And then even the trees, for example, the ones that don't make food, those are the ones that you can use to build stuff.
Yeah, verse 14 says, as for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these and plunder. Then when you jump to 16, or 17 rather, completely destroy them, right? 16, do not leave alive anything that breathes.
Yeah, well, I guess after you take the women and children and livestock,
But it's in two
then
different
everything
cases.
that's
Oh,
left.
no,
Yes.
it refers to verse 14 refers to like I think the Canaanites, but verse 15 to 16, 15 it reads, "You shall deal with all the towns that lie very far from you." So it refers to I think it refers to cities outside of Canaan.
Yeah,
If I-
so
Right.
the
So
earlier.
one way of reading it is, in these towns you may take the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else as your plunder, but in these
Yes.
other towns, kill everything.
Yeah, so the 7 nations are traditionally the ones that you're supposed to destroy completely, but
So it
I mean,
does
we know they
include
didn't
the
really do it
livestock.
in the end. It does say. I don't think it says everything that breathes. I think it says every soul. No.
Yeah,
16.
Lord
Well,
Chayek
if
Kol
you're
Neshama.
reading the Hebrew. I only have an English translation.
Yeah, I guess the word neshama
Also
literally
breath.
means breath. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. So
Yeah.
it could mean that the animals and children were, well, the young girls would have been spared, like we saw in the other parts.
Yeah.
Or it could mean everything, but I'm not sure.
Because this is the God of infinite loving mercy and morality.
I mean, remember, this is also written after this had already happened in their legends. So
Yeah.
they weren't too fussy about making it realistic.
Oh yeah,
No, like-
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole in verse 15, yeah, thus shall you treat all the towns that are very far from you. Those are the ones that you can take spoils from, and the ones that you're actually taking, you are to take them completely.
Yeah, and Ibn Ezra specifies who are not of the 7 nations, basically the non-Canaanites.
Mm.
Okay,
Okay.
so I start my
Tomer.
comment. I start my comment. Yes, on verse 1, Tigay notes that chariotry has a great psychological value because of its ability to surprise and shock the enemy, as seen in 2 Kings 7:6-7, Jeremiah 8:16, and Ezekiel 26:10. The horses and chariots in this verse are in the singular, but they are colloquial, and as Rashi writes, as if they are like a single horse. On verse
Although
2,
I would like to point out on that one though,
Yeah.
so the the thing is, in biblical texts, God is often seen as having his own horses and chariots. So there is this vision. I forget which prophet has it. It's in the Deuteronomistic history, but like there's this siege that's coming, and the prophet looks out the window, and he is showing, like, there's this dude who's scared, right, that they're all gonna die. Then the guy's like, "No fear, we have the armies of Yahweh behind us." And then like there's this vision of horses and chariots in the sky. So God, because he is a war god, he has access to these things. The use of horses and chariots were a hallmark of God's power. So like that's when earlier on when they said, "Oh, you'll see their horses and chariots, but don't be afraid, God is behind you." It's because he has his own horses and chariots, and they're far stronger. So this was a biblical motif for exemplifying God's power, but people couldn't have that, which is why he was so anti them getting horses and chariots.
Yeah. So on verse 2, Lundbom notes that during the period of Saul and David, priests are seen to be accompanying the army, as well as carrying sacred utensils, trumpets, and the ark, and consulting Yahweh by Urim and Thummim, as in 1 Samuel 4:4, 14:3, and 18:36-42. He also notes that in the Qumran War Scroll, the priest plays a prominent role, addressing the congregation before battle, offering prayers before, during, and after the battle, giving words of encouragement, and directing troop movements by blowing the trumpet. On verses 5-8, Nelson notes that granting deference from battle was common in the ancient world, as seen in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Legend of Keret. He further writes, although scholars have sometimes spoken of a humane ethic at this point, or the protection of family life, it is really an understanding of the genre of futility curse that opens the door for proper interpretation. Futility curses are found in ancient treaties and in 28:30-34. Like the operation of a futility curse, premature death in battle would break the natural relationship between an initial act and its expected consequence, the anticipated next step in continuity with the first step. This sort of futility undermines the natural and expected order of the cosmos. These regulations are intended to prevent Israel from coming under the influence of the curse of futility and to permit enjoyment of the good things given by Yahweh. The discharge questions are powered by a rhetoric of opposition. The subject matter is formulaic and general, and has as its theme the enjoyment of the basic good things of a full life. On verse 6, and not begun to enjoy it. In Hebrew, it's lo chilelu. The root chet lamed lamed usually means to make profane use, i.e., to desacralize something. As in Leviticus 19:23-25, Jeremiah 31:5, Saadia Gaon, Tigay, and Nelson. According to Leviticus, the first fruits can be eaten only until the 5th year. Thus, Rashi rendered, did not redeem it during the 4th year. And Ibn Ezra Chizkuni, I like this, they derived chilel from the root chalil, flute, and so rendered, and did not play music over it, i.e., did not harvest his vineyard, as in Judges 21:21. Kind of creative, in my opinion. On verse 7, Lundbom comments, newly married men were excused from battle for 1 year in 24:5. Here, the man has paid the bride price, i.e., betrothal, compared 22:23-25, and Genesis 34:12, but has not come to his wedding day, after which he may take his wife home. He too may be granted a deferral from battle. Things do not go this well in the legend of King Keret, where mobilization is total and the newlywed groom must leave his wife to a stranger. The situation here may have been unusual. However, in later Jewish law, the man who had betrothed a wife did not get a deferral if the war was a so-called war of duty, in Mishnah Sotah 8:7. On verse 8, this verse is in contrast with verses 1-4, which instructs soldiers to not be afraid. Nelson writes that the issue here is not the private rights of an individual, seen in verses 5 to 7, but the psychological effect of panic. Such an exception flies in the face of all state compulsion in the management of warfare. Lundbom notes that a similar decree is found in the War Scroll, but Chazal in Mishnah Sotah 8:7 decreed that in a war of duty, even the faint-hearted had to go into battle. On verse 10, an offer of peace. Nelson notes that the peace here, quote unquote, is not so much a diplomatic one, but rather a non negotiable demand for submission, and therefore either capitulation or siege. Such acts of peace, quote unquote, are known from the ancient Near East. For example, the Akkadian salimam means terms of submission. On verse 11, forced labor, the Hebrew it's mas. Nelson writes this verse.
Just one
Sorry.
thing. Also, the word Islam, Muslim, doesn't mean peace. It means to submit. Yeah, but they are, as you can see, connected.
Yeah. In verse 11, forced labor, the Hebrew it's mas. Nelson writes that this verse does not refer to enslavement of individuals, but to an imposition of tributary responsibilities on the entire subjugated community. We see this kind of forced labor employed by David over the Ammonites, as seen in 2 Samuel 12:31, and Solomon over the Canaanites who have not been expelled from the land, 1 Kings 9:15-21. On 13 to 14, Lundbom comments, a punishment more severe will be inflicted if the enemy does not surrender. All adult males will be killed, with only women, children, and beasts being spared and taken with whatever else is captured as booty. Killing all the adult males is an extreme measure, as even Calvin admits, although we do not know to what extent this mandate was carried out. Driver says the measure still falls short of the barbarities commonly practiced in antiquity, where the most violent deaths came to women and children. The Old Testament gives us some lurid examples, like Amos 1:3-13, Hosea 14:1, which is 13:16 in the Old Testament, and 2 Kings 8:12. We learn also about impalings and other tortures from Assyrian texts that have come to light. It is generally agreed that Israelite warfare disallowed torture. Captured women from a distant city could be taken by Israelite men as wives, as seen in 21:10-14, which we'll discuss. Yeah. On verse 16, anything that breathes. Nelson notes that the Deuteronomic history understood this term to refer to human population only, sparing the cattle as booty, as in 2:34-35, 3:47, and Joshua 10:40, etc. Tigay notes that the annihilation of the enemy population was a frequent and acceptable practice in the ancient world, the basis of which was not ethic but behavioral. Ethnic, not ethic, ethnic. Yeah, sorry. On 17, Tigay comments, modern scholars hold that this law is purely theoretical and was never in effect. In their view, the populations of only a few Canaanite cities were annihilated, but most were not. There is much evidence in favor of this view. Archaeology has found only a few Canaanite cities that seem to have been destroyed by the Israelites when they arrived in the land at the beginning of the Iron Age. Pre-Deuteronomic laws in Exodus speak of the Canaanites being expelled rather than annihilated, and the narratives of Judges, Kings, and Joshua 15-17 indicate that many were neither expelled nor annihilated, but were spared and subjected to forced labor. Some scholars suggest that even Deuteronomy did not originally require annihilating the Canaanites. In their view, Deuteronomy's original law consisted only of 20 verses 10-14, according to which all cities are to be offered terms of submission. They note that Joshua 11:19 and 15-17 and Judges all reflect this form of the law. In this view, the following paragraph in Deuteronomy, verses 15-18, is a later supplement that modifies the original law by restricting the requirement to offer the option of surrender to foreign non-Canaanite cities. This supplement is reflected in Deuteronomy 7:1-5 and 16-26, and the narratives of Joshua 6-11. But it is based on theoretical reconstruction, conceived at a later time when the Canaanites had ceased to exist as a discernible element of the population in Israel, to account for their disappearance. On verses 19-20, Weinfeld notes that it was common practice to cut down trees during war, with Lundbom noting the Egyptians and Assyrians doing this. According to 2 Kings 3:19-25, God orders Elisha to cut down the trees of Moab, stop up its wells of water, and ruin its fields. Tigay notes that traditional commentators try to harmonize that incident with the present law. Some, like David Kimchi, argue that the law only applies when there is a siege. Others, like Numbers Rabbah 21:6 and Rashi, think that God made an ad hoc exception in the case of Moab. Rashbam argued that trees which are close to the besieged city can be cut down, since they serve as potential hideouts for the enemy and giving shelter to people trying to flee. And finally, are the trees people? In Hebrew, ki ha'adam etz hasadeh. As Tigay notes, the syntax of the Hebrew is difficult. If read literally, the phrase reads, because the man tree of the field. At least in literally. He writes the phrase could be read as a rhetoric question. Are trees of the field human to withdraw before you into the besieged city, according to the JPS, Septuagint, and the Rashi? Or the trees are not like human enemies, and if so, why should they run away from you? This brings a humanitarian and not utilitarian reasoning for the prohibition. The Vulgate reads, for it is a tree and not a man. Targum Onkelos, for is not the tree in the field a man. The reading requires understanding the hey in ha'adam as the beginning of a question. And that's it for my commentary.
Thank you for that, Tomer. Got one more comment here. The Unlucky Legume offers $20. Thank you very much for that. And says, so if you were wealthy enough and didn't want to go to war, you could just keep buying a new wife every year?
I mean, we can do that now.
I think the limit. I think the limit was 4 wives for a regular person.
No, in Islam.
I think it also in Judaism
Yeah,
was 4 until they got rid of polygamy. Like, but I think it was. I mean, I don't know. Maybe at the time when this law was written, it might have been more than that. But if a king can only have 18, then I imagine a regular person couldn't have more than a certain amount either.
So Solomon only had 18?
Solomon had more.
Solomon was said to have 1,000. So
How did he get
They were
anything done?
foreign. They were foreign, which is worse.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys. And so now we will jump into 21, 22, and 23. I don't think we're going to be able to get through them all on Tuesday, but I understand there's a continuity thing that we want to adhere to for these chapters. So shooting for that. That's why I wanted to do 20 today. Thank you for that. All right, everybody good for Tuesday?
Yes.
Take
Sure.
fast? Yes.
Maybe.
All right. Well, any closing comments?
21 is
Happy-
gonna be fun.
join the Discord.
Yeah.
Come join
Yes,
us.
yes. That's where the
Okay.
memes live.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night, canoes.
Bye, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.